Well, ladies and gentlemen, it falls to me to close events, and you'll be pleased to hear that I'm not going to attempt to provide a summary of what we've been through over the last day and a half. I think that would be a cruel and unusual punishment at this stage of the proceedings. But what I would like to do in probably 6.5 minutes is to share with you at least some surface impressions of mine, trying to pull together a few themes over the course of these proceedings. What we will do at ASPI is attempt to produce a more thought-through distillation of ideas as a result of this. But let me perhaps put 5 or 6 markers out in terms of my personal reactions to the deliberations and discussions that we have had. The first is clearly that the modern land environment, I think, is becoming more dangerous, and the modern soldier needs better protection and situational awareness. Improved protected mobility, I think, is a must. Land 400 has to set the right balance of protection and project risk. The modern soldier is also part of a system, maybe even a system of systems, of weapons, of sensors, of communications. It's not just a bloke carrying stuff, and of course it's not even just a bloke exclusively anymore. And like the rest of the ADF, each Army element is a node in an integrated network. So there's no such thing as just a truck. And I think we've still got a long way to get to a point of actually understanding, what the force is, what the multiplier effects of that concept is. A second conclusion is that I think posture as well as force structuring is clearly taking on greater prominence in terms of priority for thinking through what our policy interests are. So from the very start of this conference, we were told that the Army is going to need to do more across a wider region. Now, I think that's partly a response to what is clearly a riskier and more difficult strategic environment. Personally, I have to say I don't think that this is really an issue which goes to the numbers of Bahasa or Pidgin speakers that we have. I actually think it's about a more thoroughgoing use of defence in conflict prevention and confidence building across a much wider span of geography than we have been used to thinking in Australian policy statements, because the strategic effects in those places, the strategic developments in those places impact very directly on Australian security. So the opportunity for the Defence Force, and I suspect in many cases for Army playing a leading role to be engaged on a global canvas, is going to happen wherever Australia has strategic interests. And that points, I think, to the need to think through in a more thoroughgoing way the demands of engagement. What is the strategic plan behind those demands of engagement? That's going to have to be something shaped by more than just a perception of an exercise schedule between any of the services. And it means that white papers can't be solely about future capability design. They also have to set out coherent views about current posture in the here and now. One thing I think, and I'd reflect on this with General Toolan here, is that there is a major opportunity for growth in US cooperation beyond the current early days of the enhanced relationship package. And I think actually the General's comments about the opportunities that could flow from more complex instrumented ranges is something that we need to look at very seriously. The Prime Minister is off to Singapore this weekend to talk about developing a closer strategic relationship with Singapore, which I think is evolving quite quickly for a range of factors. And there too, if the Singaporeans go down the track of acquiring Joint Strike Fighter, which has been in contemplation for a very long period of time, well, they too will need to and see the advantage of collaboration around instrumented ranges. My third proposition is to say that joint is clearly the new black. I think it's clear that jointery is increasing and it's becoming relevant not simply to what the purple parts of the organisation do. Joint is as much about single service interests as well. And this reverses an old cultural stereotype. Increasingly, single service success will be defined in terms of winning the race to the joint enablement of capability. And if this is a period, as the Chief of Army said yesterday, which could become a tipping point for jointery, I think we should pause to ask also about the role of the defence civilian arm in this process. Surely it won't be the case that just as the ADF becomes more purple, the civilian arm of the organisation becomes less joint. I think we need to guard against that to some extent. But remember, the First Principles Review talks about the need to take service people out of combined military and civilian workplaces. I'm not a fan of that judgment. I think that would be a backward step in many cases in the organisation. And that leads me to my next point about the First Principles Review puzzle. It's been an underlying theme of a number of parts of our discussion over the last day and a half. And the key question is, well, how are we going to get there? Will the First Principles Review show the way, or will it red card the organisation into stasis? It desperately needs to be the first outcome. Increasingly, one hears worries that it might be the second. And I think most particularly what we need is more creative thinking around the capability manager roles and the allocation of human and financial resources to the capability managers. Second last observation is around amphibiosity. I rather think we build the amphibious cat in this conference. I confess to being a little bit puzzled about where we really are with amphibiosity. Listening to the Prime Minister yesterday, I got the impression that he sees substantial amphibious capability as something that is in the short-term process of being delivered. But actually there's a lot more to it. It's a little bit like the difference between thinking that you're buying a house full of furniture versus actually receiving a bunch of IKEA flat packs and an Allen key. I think we need to have a much more direct set of conversations around what amphibious capability is really needed and really will be delivered for the Army. And we need to be careful to set out the right understandings and expectations about what it is that we could and should do in terms of amphibious capability. It's possible that an LHD fitted for but not with amphibiosity may lead to tears before bedtime. Not mine, I hope. Resources. In many ways, I think we live in the best possible world. The Prime Minister's recommitment to a 2% spend is significant, and doubly more so in the current financial context. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that it has bipartisan support. Certainly, Mr. Feeney's comments point to force structure ambitions that would fully absorb 2% of gross national product and maybe even a little bit more. So that means I think this conference has been able to avoid a good deal of the hand-wringing that we might have seen in the 2009 to 2013 period, when it was cuts rather than spending growth, which was the reality. So as Margaret Thatcher says, might have said, rejoice, but spend it wisely. I thought I should also offer a comment about Chris Jenkins' maturing of defence industry relations. I agree with you, Chris. We've had this conversation many times. I think that is a critical missing dimension that needs to become part of a stronger defence and industry relationship. And I think all the language that we heard in this conference was really pointing us to a deeper form of industry integration with defence on capability development. We heard this implicitly and explicitly from our political speakers over the last few days. Now, I don't underestimate, frankly, just how challenging this is going to be. Even with the right structures put in place, there is also going to be a significant cultural change requirement to bring about a genuine appreciation of industry's role as a fundamental input to capability. The thought did occur to me, Chris, one way to perhaps move that along is to develop some case studies around what has been successful, the PMV, for example, and maybe we should think about that. So I get the intent, but the actual steps to be taken to achieve this new type of relationship are a little unclear. Army can play a role in this, it seems to me, a trailblazing role by establishing its own approach to integrating and collaborating more effectively with industry to build the right relationships, and Land 400 becomes, if I can use the term, the right vehicle for that process. So it just remains to me to offer some thanks. Firstly, of course, to our sponsors. We literally couldn't do it without you. Army, the collaboration, Gus, has been great, very enjoyable, very effective, and I'm grateful to you and your colleagues for making that happen. Talis, as our principal, as our prime sponsor, as always, a great relationship. Rheinmetall, UNSW Canberra, Defence SA, BAE Systems and Saab, all good friends of ASPI, all wanting to help us contribute to a strong and effective public debate. I would particularly like to mention Michael Clifford and Karen Edwards, our events manager, who has put in, as always, a sterling effort. The more smooth a conference looks, the harder the work that has taken place underneath the surface to deliver that outcome. And the ASPI team, who has sort of quietly snuck in towards the back of the room. Again, thanks to you guys. Could everyone please give them a round of applause? In events like this, what we hope to do is create conferences which make a real contribution to public policy outcomes, things that are policy relevant but also combining intellectual rigour with real world challenges. That's the aim that we set for ourselves. I hope you think that to some degree we achieved that this time. I would welcome anyone's thoughts about what we should do next. So to all of you who attended, thank you for doing so. To our senior figures from overseas, thank you for taking the time. It's never a trivial thing to come to Canberra. I do appreciate that. Safe journeys home to all of you. And now, please join us for some lunch out the back of the lecture room. Thank you.